Hi, I'm Grace. That's Yorick. Welcome to Workshop for Shakespeare's Rhetoric. Yeah, totally. Rhetoric. Got it. What's that? So rhetoric is just the art of making a speech effective. Remember, Shakespeare was a playwright, so he wrote lines for people to speak on a stage, rather than words for somebody to read inside their head 400 years later.
Thank you. Oh, and just one more thing. Yeah. That is for every schoolboy and schoolgirl for the next 400 years.
He had to know how to make his speeches good, not only for the audience, but for the character who was trying to persuade another character on stage to do what they wanted them to do. Shakespeare used a lot of tools in order to get his point across in the spoken word. I've broken them down into 4 categories: rhythm, repetition, antithesis, and metaphor. Don't pass out, don't fall asleep, don't worry, we're gonna break it down. Rhythm is something that you already know if you watched the last couple of videos about Shakespeare's verse, or iambic pentameter, but we haven't really talked about why Shakespeare wrote in poetry, except to differentiate his characters. As an actor, I've discovered that iambic pentameter is actually way easier to memorize as well. It's more like memorizing song lyrics than a big chunk of text. Also, iambic pentameter was just fashionable at the time. Everybody was doing it, so if you wanted to keep up with the times, you had to write in iambic pentameter. And the theory goes that in the rhythm of how a character speaks are a bunch of clues to their emotional lives. If you are speaking in a rhythm, then you know just what you're saying all the time. As opposed to, wait, what was I saying? I'm not sure if this even counts as verse, because, hold up, here's a parenthetical. I have a lot of questions with no answers. Here's a better example. In the first scene of Romeo and Juliet, a street brawl breaks out. No one is speaking in verse, everyone is throwing stuff at each other, having a sword fight, blood is drawn, and the prince has to show up and bring order to this chaos. And he does it with verse. Rebellious subjects, enemies to peace, profaners of this neighbor-stained steel, will they not hear? What ho, you men, you beasts, that quench the fire of your pernicious rage with purple fountains issuing from your veins, on pain of torture from those bloody hands, throw your mistempered weapons to the ground and hear the sentence of your moved prince.
Counsel and Capulet! Hold me not, let me go!
Thou shalt not stir 1 foot to seek a foe!
Rebellious subjects! Enemies to peace! Profaners of this neighbor-stained steel! Will they not hear? What ho! You men! You beasts! On pain of torture, from those bloody hands, throw your mistempered weapons to the ground and hear the sentence of your moved prince!
On the flip side, we also have somebody like Hamlet, who enters the stage believing that he's alone, contemplating whether or not he should live or he should die. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep. Is this even in verse?
To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them. To die. To sleep no more.
So the rhythm of the lines can tell an actor a whole lot about how to play the character. But you can't really talk about rhythm without talking about repetition. Repetition, 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 repetition. There is all kinds of repetition in Shakespeare's works. You can impress your English teacher if you know the word epizeuxix, which is just a fancy way of saying a repetition of words. Epizeuxix, epizeuxix, epizeuxix. Shakespeare repeated words so that his characters could really drive home an emotional point. Macbeth is existential.
Tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow.
Lear is very sad.
How? How? How?
Othello is mad and wants to cut someone.
Weak for my revenge. Yet be content. Blood!
I think you get the point. Shakespeare also repeated sounds within the word, so not just the whole word, but what the word sounds like. Here's two new fancy words for you. Assonance and consonance. Be careful with that first one. Assonance is the repetition of vowels, and consonance is the repetition of consonants. Consonants, consonants, For example, when Juliet finds out that Romeo might be dead, the vowel that she keeps repeating is I. I am not I if there be such an I. To me, that means Juliet is kind of stuck in the moment and can't really get past the news that her husband might be dead. About 5 lines after, Lady Macbeth says, "Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it." She's got all these S's to end her speech. Give solely sovereign sway and masterdom. Lady Macbeth is a snake. Here's what I know you're familiar with. Rhyming! Shakespeare would rhyme all of the time. I did not do that on purpose. A lot of his characters spoke in rhyming couplets. Like we saw with Richard II, sometimes it was just to show everybody how clever you are. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, everybody speaks in rhyming couplets when everything is going really well, and all the lovers are in love with each other, and it sounds very much like one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. And then they get into the woods, and they want to tear each other's eyes out, and they stop rhyming. A rhyming couplet at the end of your speech can really put a button on the end, but also I like to think that a rhyming couplet ends the scene, and the actors backstage are listening for that rhyming couplet to know when to enter. That way you don't need to memorize your friend's entire speech when you've got all of your own lines in your head. You just have to be backstage listening for that one obvious cue. Okay, so we know about rhythm, we know about repetition in many different forms. I'd also like to talk about antithesis. You already know what antithesis is, because you know what a thesis is. You need them in order to write English papers. A thesis is a point you're trying to make. So an antithesis is 2 different points, a point here and a point there, compared against each other. It's a statement like, not this, but that, or if this, then that. Antithesis shows what is by giving an example of what is not. Give every man thy ear, but few thy voice. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. Some rise by sin, and some by virtue fall. As an actor, I find antithesis really handy because it's not always in a very short statement. Sometimes it's an entire speech. Hamlet's to be or not to be speech, for example, is all one entire antithetical speech, contrasting to be, or the slings and arrows of this outrageous fortune, against not to be, or that undiscovered country that happens after death. Antithesis is really helpful to me because once I find it, I can understand the structure of the thought, whether that's a really small thought or a really big speech. Okay, last one, and then we will review. A metaphor is a statement that compares directly 2 very unlike things in order to show the similarities between the 2. It's a statement that doesn't use like or as. If you use like or as, you are writing a simile, not a metaphor. Examples of a metaphor in modern English would be, this room is a pigsty, or that guy is a beast. Shakespeare used this all the time. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. She doesn't shine like the sun, she is the sun.
You are the sunshine of my life.
Beware, my lord, of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on. Jealousy is literally a monster sitting on your shoulder with bright green eyes, eating your brain whenever you feel jealous. Life's but a walking shadow. A poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. This one is one of my favorites, because while Macbeth is using the metaphor, life is but a walking shadow, life is a poor player on the stage, literally, the dude in front of you saying these lines is an actor on the stage. That's some pretty smart writing, I think. Metaphors are great because they paint a really clear image and tell the audience exactly what that character is thinking and feeling. Yorick, take over. Sorry. Every time I talk about metaphor, it really makes me sneeze. Yeah, it really sets off my analogies. Okay, I promised a review, so here we go. Today we talked about Shakespeare's Rhetoric. We started with rhythm, or Shakespeare's verse, and what the rhythm can tell you about what's happening in the speech. Then we talked about repetition in many different ways. We talked about epizeuxics, which is the repetition of a specific word. We talked about assonance and consonance, assonance being the repetition of a vowel, and consonance being the repetition of consonants. And we talked about rhyme and rhyming couplets and what those do for your speech. We also talked about antithesis, not this, but that, or if this, then that, setting up two different things in order to form a thought. And we talked about metaphor, comparing two very unlike things directly without the use of like or as in order to show some kind of similarity between the two things. Whew, that is a lot. I hope this video helps you with any Shakespeare speech that you were assigned to speak out loud in class. I hope it helps you get better at public speaking in any kind of way. Maybe you're in forensics. And I hope it helps you learn some words that will impress your English teacher next time you talk to them. If you're part of the discussion section, I want to hear from you about if you hear any of these things in modern media, like podcasts or YouTube videos or television shows or movies or whatever you're listening to. Thanks very much, and I'll see you next time.